Hello. Is anyone there? Testing, testing. Today we're going to talk about T.H. White's book, The Once and Future King. The Once and Future King is a book with an unusual publication history. It started being written in 1934, somewhere around there, and the first volume of it was published before World War II. It was called The Sword and the Stone. This is the form in which most people are familiar with it, thanks to the Disney movie that was made in the 60s. And as published on its own, it was quite a success. It tells the tale of a young King Arthur growing in obscurity in medieval England, being taught by his mentor Merlin. Other volumes of the book came out that follow the Arthurian legend, and the book is closely inspired by Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, the late 15th century poem from which a great deal of the Arthurian material that we know it springs. Malory's book draws on earlier material about Arthur, but because it comes later in the medieval period, it's much more understandable to a modern audience. White supposedly read Malory's Morte d'Arthur and realized that it actually had tragic themes and decided to use it to address something of what was going on in his world. In the 1930s in England, if you were a young writer like White was, and you were trying to produce work that spoke to people, one of the main issues that you would likely write about was war. World War I ended in 1918, and there was a general feeling among people who came to maturity after the war that the war had been a huge mistake on every side, and that something needed to be done about this propensity for unabashed conflict. If you're not familiar with the details of World War I, a short version might help. It began in 1914 and it ended 4 years later. The last figures I read suggested that about 20 to 25 million people died, mostly soldiers. Every great country and every small country in Europe was involved in the war, and by the end of it, it was unclear what had been accomplished. Great Britain had been the largest empire in the world, and at the end of World War I it still was, but the loss of so many of their young men for what seemed to be no particularly strong reason, this vision of a war that was so destructive that anything you could have gotten out of this war was not worth it, tended to produce a deep, almost revolutionary cynicism among British writers of this time, at least the ones who began work during this period. And you see this across the political spectrum. Writers on the conservative or Tory side, like Evelyn Waugh, produced very cynical books about his society during this period. And writers on the left, the one I'm most familiar with is George Orwell. He and Waugh were actually, friends and respected each other as writers. Orwell's work also produced a picture of British society that was generally quite dark. It was suggested that the social institutions were generally corrupt and callous, that they were generally aimed at reproducing themselves without regard for the conscience of anyone involved, that the empires were exploitative, which they were, and that widespread domestic poverty was simply something to kind of be ignored or hushed up. White takes an unusual position in this world, something more retiring and scholarly, and it comes out deeply in The Once and Future King. The Once and Future King is the story of a young boy who eventually will discover that he's the son of the king and destined to be King Arthur. And the part of the book that most people are familiar with, again, because it's the one that was made into a movie, a pretty fun one, as far as I can recall, and also that was published on its own. I believe you can still find it published on its own, and it's significantly different than the version that is in the Once and Future King. I do recommend both versions. There are some things in the original standalone Sword in the Stone that are missing from the version that's Once and Future King that are quite good and well put together. The main thing that Arthur... Let me start over. Arthur's growing up as a young boy in a medieval estate in northern England, and he does not know anything about his parentage, but he is being raised as the adopted son of Sir Ector. Sir Ector is a nice ruler. He is kind to his people and cares about them. He's a bit of a sort of a bluff, sort of a P.G. Wodehouse type character who makes mistakes and goofs up and says the wrong thing, but is generally a good person. And he's adopted Arthur, who everyone calls the Wart, which is one of the best things in the book. The Wart is thus being raised as as an aristocrat, and so he gets actual education. He's not a serf. His status is a little unclear to him, although he does understand that he will not inherit Ector's estate and that he's not Ector's natural son. However, he's a happy enough boy as it is, and he does admire Ector's natural son and heir, Kay, who will someday be Sir Kay, and the plan is that Wart will be Kay's squire. And they grow up together. Kay is a little older, and the Wart really admires him. One day they go out hawking. They're going to hunt rabbits with the goshawk that belongs to Ector, and the hawk escapes. Kay is hawking, and he launches the hawk at the wrong time, and the hawk flies off into the forest. And Wart feels badly about this and responsible, and like they need to go recover it. And Kay feels deeply embarrassed. One of the best things about The Once and Future King, one of the things that makes it one of the best fantasy novels, is that the lesser characters, like Kay, are very, very well drawn. They're very psychologically real. Kay, for example, is a classic person born to command, although psychologically he's best suited to follow. And because of this, he tends to do the wrong thing, stand on his dignity and his role. He doesn't actually feel the kind of superiority that he thinks leaders need to have, and so he fakes it. And because he fakes it, he winds up doing bullying things and saying cruel things to the Wart, and then being too proud to actually step back and apologize. He doesn't have the touch. Ector generally has the touch. He has the touch of leadership through service that leads to people actually generally admiring him and doing what he said. Ector is a very Dickensian character. He reminds me of one of the good rich guys from Charles Dickens novels. And the Wart is our reader's stand-in character. He's the one you're expected to identify with and to follow through on his adventures. So Kay feels embarrassed they lost the hawk, and it's partly because it was his fault. He shouldn't have flown the hawk when he did, and so on. But Wart feels responsible, and he's worried about the hawk because the hawk is, not used to being out in the forest, and he's worried about what will happen to it. He's worried about how they will embarrass the falconer at their estate if they come back losing a hawk. And Kay wants to just bluff it out and go home because he can't stand for very long to explore his mistakes. He would rather just sort of ride them out by pretending like it wasn't a mistake because it all belonged to him in the first place. So right away we see that the Wart has a sense of responsibility both to other people, even those who he might have been expected to think of as his subordinates or lesser people, and to animals. The Wart has an active sympathy for the world that is seemingly instinctive. He has it right when we get to know him. And this leads him to make choices, and he chooses to stay in the forest and try to get the hawk back. The hawk's name is Cully, by the way, so I'll call him Cully. The Wart decides to go find Cully. The forest, it makes clear, is not a pretend play around. It's a serious forest with real dangers for someone as young as the Wart. I think we're expected, I do not recall exactly, I think the Wart's about 9 when this is going on. And he, he's in danger of wolves, bears, outlaws, just general hazards. And he goes looking for Cully, and in the course of it, he's hunted. Some arrows appear out of nowhere. He has a sort of classic overnight adventure in the woods for a young character in these sorts of stories. And he finds refuge at an unusual house somewhere in the forest. And the house is the house that belongs to Merlin. Merlin is the character that people tend to remember from The Once and Future King, because he's so distinctive. He's such a lovely vision of that kind of magician, mentor, teacher. It's impossible for me not to see him as the origin of Dumbledore, for example. He's the kind of like a little absent-minded, knows everything but doesn't share it all with you. He doesn't easily explain himself, but he often will go on a sort of tangent and tell you a lot of interesting things. And he's got this beautiful house that's just filled with like the wreckage of all sorts of experiments and collections and explorations, and his magic is very charming and personal and not at all threatening. So for example, he has dishes that wash themselves up, and he has a talking owl, but the owl is very shy and doesn't like to talk to strangers, and it takes a while for the owl and the wart to get along. And of course, it turns out that the wart has been on a quest for a new instructor, and Merlin is there to fill that need. He helps him find the hawk, and they go back to the castle where Merlin becomes the new tutor and lives up in a tower above the castle where, everyone else kind of ignores him, but to the wart and to Kay, he's like their new tutor. So we're now set for the part of the book that is the most fun and the most charming and is also just wonderfully well written, which is basically the education of the wart. This is the largest part of the book. I believe it's roughly 30% of the total book is the education of the wart. And White uses Merlin as his method for teaching the wart about the world, and the way that Merlin does it is by giving the wart exposure to new situations without telling him directly what he will learn from them. I think this is great. This is a really progressive vision of education. It's made clear before Merlin arrives that the wart's education up to this point has been quite traditional, of reading boring books and listening to people talk and not really having any idea what any of this has to do with anything. And White generally presents this as kind of a waste of time. So White's vision of education, as expressed by Merlin, is more about let people interact with real life scenarios and observe them without telling them exactly what they're going to learn from them. I think this is great. And because Merlin is a magician, he can do this by transforming the wart into different kinds of animals, or magically knowing where something that the wart should witness is happening, and then being able to like tell him where to go or send him there. He does not like leave the wart completely alone, but he does let him experience real risks and forces him to make real choices. And this is extremely valuable. I get the feeling that White was a huge animal lover. He wrote other books primarily about animals. He wrote one about his own attempts to train a hawk, medieval style. And the portions with the animals are just some of the best writing about animals that I've ever run into. He imagines the wart. He imagines how a human child would really react to being turned into a different kind of animal, and what they would find interesting about it, and what they would explore it, and how things would look. There's a fantastic sequence where he turns Merlin, although I guess Merlin is really the stand-in for White, so we could say either one. I wonder if Merlin was sort of White's vision of himself. He did live in a little hut kind of out of the way for a while. Maybe he felt like a weirdo wizard while he was writing this book. I don't know. Merlin turns the wart into a fish in the castle moat. And there's these wonderful passages where the wart learns about what it's like to be fully immersed in the medium of water, and what that implies, and how there are these different planes now that he can look up and he can see the surface, and he looks down and see the bottom of the moat and interact with these new creatures and move in totally different ways. It's just really, really evocative. Merlin's magic, by the way, is a wonderful example of using the idea of magic fictionally to really make you feel something's something different is happening, that like the universe is expanding around you in a way that magic in fantasy literature is often used more or less as just kind of like technology we haven't figured out yet, convenient plot devices. I think I've heard the term Mick magic. There's no Mick magic in this book. It's all very personal, and it's an extension either of Merlin's personality or his way of extending the Wart's vision of the world and his understanding of why people do what. Merlin doesn't have any deep morals specifically. He lets the Wart encounter situations and think about them and reflect on them. We don't usually hear what the Wart thinks about them. It's usually made fairly clear what he's learning from these situations. Like, for example, in the castle moat, he eventually encounters a pike being the largest, most aggressive fish in the moat. And the pike teaches him about the naked use of force. That fundamentally, when you get right down to it, it's a dog-eat-dog world or a pike-eat-fish world. And he literally plays this out by trying to eat the Wart, which the Wart barely escapes, and then Merlin turns him back into a boy. Spoilers for all of this, by the way. And the lesson is clear without it having to have some scene where Merlin is like, now you know the limits of true power, or now you know. There's no moral. It's clear to the reader what the Wart might have learned from that. And I also point out, it's not explicitly said that the pike is wrong. None of the animals or humans that the Wart meets and from whom he learns things are explicitly rejected as like liars or somehow wrong or immoral. They are all people expressing something that they've learned that's important to them, which is usually said to be at least partially true. The implications of what they believe to be partially true are often frightening, but sometimes they're wonderful and ennobling, and it's sort of implied that it's good for the Wart to run across as many different types of people and animals as he can, because it's how we become aware of all sorts of different lives that are possible, which allows us to choose what of those lives we ourselves would want. Okay. The Wart encounters other people. He hangs out with Robin Hood. He's turned into other different kinds of animals. And as he grows, he becomes aware of the sort of the rules that are governing his own place in the world and what he is expected. And then all of a sudden, apparently, of course, he is elevated to the kingship of all England. This is the sword and the stone passage that's famous from many different... It's become a trope in all fantasy. People just sort of assume you know it. You take this sword out of the stone, you become king of England. So he comes to this sword. He doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know that he's the one. And he pulls it out, and now he's in the position of governing the country without any explicit training for the matter. But one thing that his adventures with Merlin have done is, by seeing how different creatures govern themselves and what they think is important and how they structure their lives, how they structure their society, is he has been, as it were, acculturated to the idea that things can be done differently. This is one of the main issues, and this is part of why the book is better than most fantasy novels, for sure, is that the Wart, I guess we can call him Arthur now, Arthur wants to bring a change into the world. Most adventurers are in the position of defending some sort of status quo, or making some slight improvement, but usually it's the extent of, we are going to defend the status quo, or we are going to make some obvious rectification of an awful situation. You know, we're going to overthrow a tyrannical government because we all can identify it and we just need to work at it. Or, you know, some threat threatens a decent society and we're going to work to defuse the threat. But what makes the Once and Future King special, perhaps even among fiction generally, not just adventure fiction or fantasy fiction, is that Arthur wants to bring a new ethic into the world. He wants to rewrite the rules of his society. There's this scene where he tells his scheme. He's now, you know, a young man. He tells his scheme to Merlin. And again, Merlin has not been forcing this. Merlin seems to understand that he can't just directly tell Arthur anything. That perhaps Arthur will land on ideas that Merlin thinks are effective. In the book, Merlin lives backwards through time. He constantly refers to like stuff that happened in the 20th century or the 19th century. And it's implied that he sort of, because of this, sees the great risks that white zone society is running when war has become so destructive that it needs to be stopped somehow because it's no longer producing anything worth the struggle and threatens to sort of ruin the entire society. It's sort of implied that he is going back to somehow try to fix this, to like interrupt the onrush of war by reaching out to society at an earlier stage so that maybe we could get away from this. In some degree, I suppose this is sort of like time travel wish fulfillment. That dream that if you could just go back and find the right spot and push history in a better direction, maybe all of World War One could have been avoided. There's definitely some of that, but it's not that obvious in the book. It's kept pretty well under wraps. But there is a suggestion that Merlin thinks there's something wrong with the way things are, and he points out that the feudal system, by elevating knights and lords above anybody else and more or less giving them freedom to behave cruelly, when you have a good person like Sir Ector, it doesn't work too badly. In fact, White spends some time in the book. He has a fairly active author voice. He doesn't just tell the tale. He like stops and shares bits of fact or, you know, jokes. Some of the book reads something like The Princess Bride, where you can really feel the storyteller's voice building the tale and making little asides. One of the other most charming things in the book, I'll get back to the Merlin thing in a minute, I suppose. One of the most charming things in the book is that everybody talks like they're in the 20th century. The dialogue and the way they talk is not dressed up in fake medievalism, you know. So you've got knights saying things like, "Oh, what ho!" almost like they're in a P.G. Wodehouse type story. And Merlin certainly talks like a modern person. Kay sounds just like every, you know, sort of insecure, slightly bullying-ish person who screws things up that anyone ever does. So you don't have to stretch to like fake Shakespearean stuff. They talk pretty much like people I imagine in the 20s and 30s. It's very vernacular, easy to read dialogue. Okay, so Arthur gets this idea prompted by his education and his concern for other people, since he did not get the education of a traditional aristocrat, and assuming that they were literally better and more important than other people, and other people were there for them to use like toys. Since he did not get that education, he's capable of conceiving of a world where people would not behave that way, where there would be some way to chasten and protect people from bad lords and bad knights. And this idea of a group of sort of knightly good guys, a group of good guy paladins protecting the weak, which eventually, of course, becomes the Round Table, and they have a very funny scene where they talk about why it'll be a round table. Inspires Merlin, and he like lifts his hands into the air and says something along the lines of like, "Thank God one of them finally gets it. Now I can die." So this idea that like maybe we should do something about war. This fits up with some of the things that were going on in the 20s and 30s in Britain when White was writing this book. This idea that we need to defeat war itself. We don't just need to like be so strong that no one will dare go to war with us. We don't need to We need to create some mechanisms by which war itself can be outlawed, defeated. Arthur's idea is the round table. What if, instead of having a bunch of privileged knights who can treat other people like crap, what if we took some of them and trained them really well and taught them to, be good? What if we taught them to be chivalrous and nice to women and children? And, yes, they are still peasants, but they're people. And what if we could do this? What if we could humanize the warriors? What if we could, maybe humanize is the wrong word. What if we could have merciful warriors? I think this is a vital concept and one we still struggle with, even in the modern day, is how do we have people who are skilled enough at the use of force to protect the rest of us without them also eventually becoming tyrants or monsters or hurting themselves or other people. This is clearly still a live issue. The rest of the book is essentially about Arthur living out the implications of this idea. He decides to actually put it into place. Since he's king, he can actually have the power to do something about this. And the story shifts away from him to Lancelot. Lancelot is a little younger than Arthur and meets Arthur when he's like 12, and he wins a tournament. Arthur sees him win this tournament and says, Lance, you're a pretty good, athlete. You seem to win a lot of games. Well, I have this idea to form a group of guys who are good at games and good at fighting, but they will only use their fighting for good. Would you like to join that? And Lancelot is smitten with this idea. He loves it. He thinks it's great. And he sort of says, yeah, I like that idea very much. Now I have to go become the best knight in the world. I'll see you later. And he spends his entire youth now training to be the best knight in the world so that he can be worthy of Arthur's idea. Lancelot, by my recollection, generally takes over most of the rest of the book. So what kind of person would be drawn to this new ethic? Now that Arthur is grown and is trying to live out the implications of his idea, who would join this idea? And this is another part of what makes the book really special, is it doesn't just go beyond the traditional youth coming to maturity novel or the person who has a good idea. It then spends much of the book struggling with how do you bring a new idea into the world? You can't do it by yourself. Who would join you? Lancelot is the main person. There are some other knights that we follow here and there. The Gawain, I don't know how to correctly pronounce some of these names, but there is a family with 4 brothers, all of whom eventually join the Round Table. Gawain is the one I remember best. Of course, is the same knightly character as Gawain and the Green Knight, and some of the others. Those of you who are really Arthurian, you'll know the kind of people I'm talking about. But Lancelot is the main one, because the idea with Lancelot is he feels like he is wrong somehow. He feels incomplete. Just as Arthur's education failed to teach him the necessary superiority for a noble knight in this era, Lancelot's failed to teach him. He lacks that basic sense of worth and rightness in the world that all sorts of people have, not just knights, of course. He feels lacking. He feels that he needs to make it up to the world somehow, just for his presence in it. That somehow the world is stained by him existing, that he was like a mistake. He takes on the name the ill-made knight, or the ill-formed knight. And part of what's so fascinating about that, it's a very modern psychological portrait. There you go. T.H. White gives us a really, really modern psychological portrait of the kind of person that we don't usually associate with the Middle Ages. But of course they were human then, and things weren't that different, all in all. And you were going to have these people who feel like they need to make it up to the world for their existence. And Lancelot really feels like he needs to make it up to the world for his existence, to the point that he sort of dreams of maybe doing a miracle or dying while saving somebody. He's really drawn to martyrdom. And so when Arthur's offer appears, and he's only 12, I believe, so this is something deep within him. He's already feeling this way. Arthur's offer appears like a revelation. Like, oh, this is what I need to do. I need to help this new idea into the world so that the world is redeemed from my presence. If I can bring this new big good thing into the world, then maybe I will feel like I have paid back the debt I owe the world. And this is just really insightful, that these are the kind of people drawn to new causes. And Lancelot, who gives, his youth to perfecting the knightly arts of combat, they make it clear that he is, the best knight in the world by the end of it, when he does actually leave as an adult to join the Round Table. Where do you go with that? What goes on afterwards? Arthur has the dream, and he takes actions to achieve it, but the ones that we actually see lived out are through Lancelot. Lancelot is the one who is actually making happen the dream and the new ethic that Arthur has envisioned because of the experiences of his education that he had through Merlin. So Lancelot is now, how would you actually do this? How do you actually tell people that there needs to be limits on their use of force? Some of these people, and this is again where White's book is really superior, because some of these people are good, quote-unquote, people. They are not villains. He does run into the occasional outright villain, someone who is using their privilege and their knightly status to do truly horrible things, but it's much more common for him to run into people who are protecting themselves from what they see as an attack on their old ethic, which they conceive of as natural, as simply the way things are, and who have convinced themselves that Arthur and Lancelot, by extension, are crazy, are dangerous innovators, or are the villains themselves. I want to get into the one I remember best from the book. So Lancelot is exploring the countryside and looking for wrongs to right, and so on, and doing the actual round table work of finding ways to protect the weak. And he comes across a knightly woman who has had her hawk fly away into the tree and wants him to help get it back, like he's a firefighter helping an old lady get her kitten out of the tree. She wants him to help get this hawk out of the tree. And he does not want to see it much as his business, but he can't really turn it down. Now that I think on it, well, let me finish. I shouldn't get an idea in the middle of a sentence, but it happens all the time. So he agrees, and in order to get up the tree, of course, he has to take his armor off and leave his horse and his sword and everything on the ground. And he climbs up and he gets the hawk. And he's about to get the hawk when the lady sort of whistles and the hawk just flies right down. The hawk was not trapped in the tree, and she picks up his armor and carries it some distance away. And then this other knight, old style knight, comes charging up to the tree and starts yelling at him. And the knight has laid this trap. He is a believer in what we would call conspiracy theories. He believes that Lancelot and Arthur are these horrible people, and that Lancelot in particular eats babies, and that his skill in battle is only because he happens to possess some magical armor which makes him invulnerable. And he has arranged this trap with his wife, where they can get Lancelot more or less naked up a tree without armor or weapons, and then they can kill him. This is a fantastic scene, partly because it shows a number of very, very true human propensities. One is that deny all virtue to someone you see as your enemy. So even if he did see Lancelot as his enemy, he could at least respect his skills. They're both knights. It should be apparent that Lancelot's worked very, very, very hard to become as good a fighter as he is, but that would not fit with his status as an enemy. You can never deny, you never easily acknowledge that an enemy has skill. So this guy has convinced himself that Lancelot's skill in battle is just due to some magical stuff he happens to have, and not to any virtue of Lancelot's that he can respect. This is very common in the world generally, which is to deny that your opponent could have any virtue that you might admire, even if they stay your opponent. And so instead, people concoct these crazy schemes. Oh, you know what? I will share. So I was thinking about the lady tricking the hero into doing something that's like, yeah, it's heroic, but it's also kind of trivial. And I was remembering they use this in the little scene superhero movie, Superman Returns, when Parker Posey, playing one of Lex Luthor's henchmen, tricks Superman into wasting some time by claiming to have heart palpitations. She gets him to rescue her from a building or something, I forget the details, and then sort of is like, I really need to go to the hospital. And he's like, well, he doesn't say it because he's Superman, he's so nice, but he's like, well, can't you just, get an ambulance or a taxi? I mean, I'm Superman. But no, she's like, no, I really need your help. And everyone's watching, so he's like, okay, I'll fly you to the hospital. It's a very funny scene. Out of context, is like, you're really wasting a hero's time here, lady. But yeah, whatever. Okay, back to Lancelot. So this guy has written a version of his story where Lancelot has no virtues, even though he's clearly a very good fighter. He just happens to have some magical armor. Okay, so we got him out of the armor. Here's the other version. So now he has also written a version, since he is a knight, and they make it clear he's not like an evil knight, he's deluded, which of course is far more common to run across confused, deluded, foolish people than evil people. How does he justify this extremely unknightly behavior on his part? As a knight, you're not supposed to take on another knight like this. You're not supposed to ambush them, you're not supposed to kill them without armor, you're supposed to give them a chance, but Lancelot's been out there for a while. It's become apparent that he's the best and that no one can defeat him using the old code. So you break the code. How do you justify breaking your code? You make it appear as though the opponent has broken the code to such a horrific degree that it is now okay to fight dirty. So he doesn't just say Lancelot is a bad guy or withdrawing. Lancelot eats babies. And if there's one thing that we can all agree on, is that someone who eats babies has to be stopped, period. This is the I'm not the monster here, you're the monster trope. You're the one who does such horrible things that I need to do whatever is necessary. You will see people jump to this in real life. You will see people dig out the worst behavior that they can find on the part of some group or cause that they oppose, and then imply that this taints them so horribly that anything we can do to stop them is justified. And he really holds to this. He has a conversation with Lancelot when Lancelot's up a tree. The one problem with his scheme is that Lancelot's up a tree. He can't climb up after him. He has to sort of wait for him to come down. So they have a chance to talk. And Lancelot observes that he can't be reached with reason or logic. He offers to fight handicapped. Lancelot does. Again, Lancelot is driven by his own feelings of inadequacy. And so when someone comes across and tells him that he's a horrible person, even though the details are completely fictitious, it kind of fits Lancelot's vision of himself. So he offers to meet the guy halfway. He'll come down and fight him as long as he can have a sword. It's kind of like a chess master offering to give up queen and rook before taking someone else on. The guy insists, though, he won't go for that. So Lancelot breaks part of the tree branch and leaps down. The guy swings at him. Lancelot catches the sword in the wood of the tree branch and pulls it away from him, and then uses the sword to kill the knight. Because in this story, Lancelot is basically invincible. He's the best. So what do you do with this invincible power? Well, you defend yourself. And then the lady is crying at the death of her husband in this scheme that he probably forced her to participate in. And he looks at her and he says, "Go away. Quit crying. Your husband was an idiot and you're a fool. Go away. I'm not sorry." And then the White writes, "But he was. He was sorry." It's extraordinarily effective. It's probably my favorite scene in the book. The book is full of insightful scenes and moments where we see how people's psyches would respond, um, and White just delivers them straightforwardly and honestly. He doesn't try to excuse. He lets people be bad. He lets people be cruel. He lets them be surprisingly self-sacrificing at times. It's a very well written book. It's a little bit of a mess from a structural point of view, but it is a very well written book with large bits that stick with you. And this is one of the biggest because Arthur is being King of Britain and Lancelot being as his invincible champion. To some extent, they represent the government monopoly on force. They represent this idea that the world would be better if one group controlled the use of lethal force rather than sort of a disparate array of feudal nobles always getting into fights and little wars, and some of them are sadists and so on. What if one group, represented by Arthur, Lancelot, and the Round Table, had the authority to use force, and anyone else who did, they could chastise them and they could bring them into line, if necessary, kill them? Wouldn't that be better for everybody? If they were good people, good-hearted, if the only people who were allowed to use force were noble and had the interests of the whole nation at heart. This is one of the biggest questions in the world. I don't see any other way to phrase it. This is one of the biggest questions in the world, is who has the authority to use violence? And then, what do you do? This is where the book continues. What do you do when the people you entrusted with the ability to do violence don't know what to do with it? So eventually, all of the bad knights and independent lords in Britain are defeated, and the Round Table is effectively the authority in the land. In fact, if I remember the book rightly, this even extends to Europe. Arthur becomes more or less the overlord of all Christendom, although Christianity formally has very little role in the book. White does acknowledge that it's there. And Arthur sets up his new ethic, and it works. He wins. His new ethic is now the new rule, and lords send their kids to Camelot to join the Round Table and so on. But now, of course, they've put themselves out of work. They don't have anyone left to chastise. They've even defeated all these other kings on the European continent who might have threatened them. And what do? Well, continuing the Arthurian legend, now you go look for the Holy Grail. You go on quests. The quest becomes not just defeating evil, it becomes sort of purification of self. The Holy Grail, of course, is a really complex image that goes back about 1,000 years to medieval chivalric romances, but in general it represents something like perfection. I believe originally it was meant to be the literal blood of Jesus, but over time the symbol twisted into like the cup that he used at the Last Supper, or a rock. In general, it's human purity, it's perfection. So the knights go looking for it, because otherwise they're just sitting around arguing with each other and fighting, and without work, they get really, they become a bunch of dogs just kind of struggling with each other and yapping at each other, and so we need to find something for them to do. Okay, they're going to go off and become perfect. Well, it does not happen easily, and they split up, and in many, many, many different ways, they all fail. Lancelot, of course, is the one that everyone thought had a chance, and he does come close, but eventually only one knight, I believe this is also out of Morte d'Arthur, only one knight, Galahad, actually achieves perfection. We don't really know anything about Galahad. Galahad also defeats Lancelot in a fight, and the implication is that becoming perfect or achieving the Grail is sort of an inhuman, impossible thing to do. You can't really expect good things to come from it. What you do instead is discover just how fully imperfect you are and the precise nature of your weaknesses. This self knowledge is valuable and is presented in the book with a sort of realism and a melancholy that is very affecting, especially when Lancelot returns from the quest and retails how he got close to the Grail but could not approach it because he wasn't good enough. He's telling this to Guinevere. There's a section with Guinevere and Arthur and Lancelot and the romantic triangle. I'm skipping it mostly because can't talk about everything in such a large book. But he comes back, and it's very, very... It's that moment in maturity when you have to accustom yourself to the idea that there's only so much time, that there's only so much worth and weight that you can bring into the world, and that not everything is going to be for you. It's very touching. And it speaks to the power of a powerful state. What do they do once they have secured their internal and external borders? This is something like the situation that we're in right now with a lot of nation states here on Earth, which is, over time, the last couple hundred years, many of them have more or less secured their borders to their satisfaction and have also brought about internal rule of law to a degree that they never used to be able to assume. What do you do now? What do you do with the state's monopoly on force? What do you do with your round table? Do you set out to become perfect, which in the real world would mean something like, do you use your monopoly on force to make your society better, to like grow the best people in the healthiest means, the best educated? Do you sort of race against other societies in terms of your general happiness and well-being? This would be something like what... There's a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, and he suggested that we think of the state as having two hands. The right hand is the monopoly on force, rule of law, war, violence, the oldest forms of the state. But then it has a younger hand, the left hand, which is more about fostering civil well-being and public health and education and general nurturing of the society so that it can improve. And the left hand of the state, of course, is younger and more controversial because of its implications for individual liberty as well as other stuff. But the idea is that what else are we supposed to do with our government? If not to pursue the left-hand dream of like a better ordered, more flourishing society. What else are we supposed to accomplish? In this case, the left hand might be those who seek after the Holy Grail. They're seeking after perfection. They're seeking to discover the imperfections and the weaknesses in the society, that in a way that can eventually have something done about them by using the right hand, by using the monopoly on force to structure things such that people can flourish better. I think it's fascinating that all of these associations and all of these connections to real-world problems appear in a fantasy novel about King Arthur. There's something so tragic about it, and there's something pretty insightful. I don't think many writers or artists are better than White at realizing how the Middle Ages and the pre-modern era still shared a lot of common problems and commonalities. It's common in history to sort of teach those eras kind of like a dark ages, almost like it's happening on another planet with totally different rules, rather than seeing it in continuity. These are our ancestors, those of us who live in Christian-dominated societies. This kind of feudal stuff, their choices mattered. They really helped create the world we live in today, and we should see their problems and solutions in a context with our own as part of a continuum or a spectrum. I think that's one thing that the Once and Future King brings out pretty well. Okay. After the Holy Grail sequences, we then face the collapse of Arthur's dream, and the narrative shifts back to him, away from Lancelot, because now Arthur, as an old man, looks out at his achievement and sees that it is lacking, that the people who he's gathered in the Round Table are still people. They're still flawed. They still suffer from jealousy and rage. Gawain, for example, has like accidentally killed someone in a rage that he's never mastered. And now there appears, like Doom appearing in a morality play, Mordred, Arthur's illegitimate son by his half sister. He did not know this at the time. He did not know they were related. But he had a child with his half sister, and that boy is now grown, and he is mad. He feels like Lancelot that his birth and his existence is wrong somehow. He feels the illegitimacy of his position. And unlike Lancelot, who takes this wrongness and follows Arthur's dream of redeeming his wrongness by doing good deeds in the world, Mordred takes the position of vengeance. He hides it. He gets close to Arthur first. He doesn't just outright attack. But he gets close to Arthur and turns some of the Round Table against him and gets control of part of the country. There's always groups who are unhappy with the person in charge. But fundamentally, Mordred feels that Arthur is the problem, that Arthur ruined his mother, that Arthur knew what he was doing, and so that the Round Table and Arthur need to be destroyed. He wants war. He wants civil war. Civil war, of course, is a whole extra level of threatening beyond the sort of tumult of lawlessness before Arthur, beyond foreign wars where countries are threatened with invasion. Civil war is that kind that breaks loyalties and that shifts things for centuries in the societies that they happen within. So Arthur, when he finds out this is happening, is unable to summon forces to meet it, because by this point people are taking Lancelot and the Round Table kind of for granted. They no longer respect the problems that it solved for them, and they can only see the problems that it creates. This is similar to something that happens to a lot of governments, which is no one remembers the problems that they came around to solve. They can only see how they are now causing problems for them. And if the governments are flexible enough and people willing to avoid civil war, they will commit, and they will shift governmental power around, make it more to their liking. But every now and then, of course, people are convinced that the government itself is the problem. So enough people follow Mordred and enough people follow Arthur, it becomes clear a massive civil war is in the offing. And then Arthur has agreed to split the kingdom. He's going to give part of the kingdom to Mordred to avoid the civil war, and no one's happy about this. Mordred's not that happy. The armies aren't that happy. To some extent, Arthur is now the last pacifist. He thinks, too, at one point in the book about how ironic it was that in the service of peace he's had to spend most of his life at war, first fighting the barons and kings of England, and then fighting all of the ones in Europe. So he's had to do a hell of a lot of fighting for someone who wants fighting to stop. But he makes this agreement, even if it's just putting off trouble to another day. And they go out to sign the treaty between the armies in the field. And something happens that's very similar to what is said to have happened for real in England in 1383, I believe, when there was a peasant rebellion led by a man named Wat Tyler. He met with the king to put down the terms of peace. Wat Tyler is said to have insulted the king, and then one of the king's retinue, a baron, just pulled out his sword and killed him right then and there. In Once and Future King, one of the people at the peace meeting in full view of both armies sees a snake in the grass, and they pull out their sword to kill the snake, and everyone takes this as a sign of betrayal and charges. And both armies charge toward each other, and Arthur is left like an old man holding out his arms, pleading, trying to get them to stop, and doesn't. And that's how the book ends. The example that Arthur and the Round Table set, it's implied, are not forgotten. There's this short scene where Arthur gives a sort of like an edict to a young squire, who I believe is supposed to be Thomas Malory, the author of Le Morte d'Arthur, basically to say, don't let them forget. Write down what we did so that they'll remember. And it's one of those, like, maybe we didn't succeed in wiping out war, but we got something going. We described what the dream was, and we made a good try, and maybe people in the future reading our story will do it better this time. And I believe the book ends literally with a famous quote from a monk during the Black Death that I've heard referred to several times in different forms of literature, where the guy says, I leave some empty pages now for any men after me to complete the tale, should any survive. It's very dramatic, because the final bits of Once and Future King were written in the 50s, after the invention of the nuclear bomb, when it became apparent that the war's powers after World War II had just gotten only greater, and that we were now in a position of possibly being literally able to wipe out the entire species. I'm sure this was not lost on White, and I'm sure that's partly why he included this reference to the Black Death, saying that war has now become such a threat that I don't know if anyone will be left to read these words much longer. It's pretty dark. It's another part of what makes the book great, because it has a realistic attitude towards the problems that it sets out to solve, and implies that so far these problems are insoluble, that war is part of the human landscape for the foreseeable future, and that these efforts to avoid it, avert it, to create organizations that have the power to quell it are flawed and going to fail, and that there is no simple way out. If there's hope, it's the situation does occasionally call for people like Arthur and Lancelot and Merlin, who they are. If the situation that keeps creating wars is their situation keeps creating them as well, and they do continue to struggle with it, which I think is why the final version is called The Once and Future King, with the implication that one day someone like Arthur will appear again with the power to do something about this horrible dilemma we're in, where wars keep appearing and butchering people, and making people who believe that this is simply normal, and this is what being human, part of what being human is being a species that wars. And this is really a central question, and it links up to other central questions about what you think about major issues of human life. Is what do you think is normal and unreformable about human life? What is fixable and what isn't? If there will always be war, if that is just a given, if that's going to happen, then so much of how we live now follows from that. So much about, constant preparation for war, constant wariness, a familiarity with violence. If that is going to, if war is inevitable for human societies, then that follows from that. If, however, war is something that is reparable, or at least limitable, something that we could control or have some ability on, then we are in a position to try new things, to make efforts that might help, that might lead to a world without war. Is that desirable? One of the other books that White wrote, which was called The Book of Merlin, which you sort of get the feeling is kind of like afterthoughts that didn't quite make it into the final book, the Once and Future King has a kind of complicated publication history, but there is this book called the Book of Merlin, where Merlin meets Arthur on his last night and tells him a couple of other things. And one of them is, let's make the case for war. Maybe if we could really make the case for war, we would understand what we would have to undermine in order to get rid of it. And they talk about like how war creates stories, how it inspires sacrifice and heroism, which is something people do want. And it's reasonably honest. I don't think White was not clearly leans towards pacifism, but he wasn't a doctrinaire pacifist who just assumed that he understood why war was bad. He let warriors make their case. I think about this a lot lately because the modern world has created so much comfort for so many that I think there is a sort of hunger for hardship and sacrifice that is running its current through the culture and making people seek out touches of what they used to get on the battlefield. I think of a essay that the satirical novelist Christopher Buckley wrote in the 80s where he talks about his regrets that he never had that sort of Band of Brothers experience, that he didn't go into the army or he was not drafted or what have you, and so he didn't have that time where he could sort of test himself against the against war that some other people he knew did, and that he envied them this. I think about these other groups in the U.S. that are like to sort of play war, that like to posture around as though they were warriors and use as much of the warrior image and ethic as they can, even though they aren't at war and the land is at peace. The popularity of things like paintball and violent video games and gun ranges and survivalism and all of these things that at least bring little pieces of the experience of war into people's lives. It seems to me to speak to the fact that there are a lot of people who would prefer to test themselves against hardship than to extend prosperity, at least some of the time. I'm not saying they would want to do it all the time or at every year of their life, but at least some of the time they enjoy the idea of encountering difficulties as realistically as possible, similar to the ones you would encounter in war. And I wonder, as war continues to sort of become so expensive and to involve so much technology, and to no longer offer the challenges that it used to offer to young people, I wonder what will be the result of this. When you have a culture that so strongly pushes people towards war, but then the actual war never happens. If we look at even in the last 20 years in the United States, war is dramatically different. The number of people who actually have the battlefield type warfare experience is pretty small. And there does not seem to be, they don't seem to be growing. We have all these people instead who are like monitoring satellites or operating drones or operating naval vessels, and I wonder what happens to those people preparing for war when the war never comes.